You draw this back to the beginning of the 1980s and the promulgation of the Carter Doctrine, when the U.S. began garrisoning large amounts of military personnel and equipment in Saudi Arabia. This was the culmination of the Carter Doctrine. What was the Carter Doctrine?
Well, again, just to give a little bit more historical context here, if we look at the post-war period, the Cold War, the U.S. has chosen, for the first time in its history, after 1945, to maintain on a permanent basis very substantial military power. We choose to become a military superpower. But in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, the focus of strategic attention is on the defense of Western Europe and the defense of East Asia. Those are the two places that we're willing to fight. During that entire period of time, minimal U.S. presence anywhere in the Islamic world, because we don't care that much about the Persian Gulf, Central Asia, and the like. That changes in 1979 as a result of two events. The first event is the overthrow of the Shah, and the second event is the one I already alluded to, which was the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Those two put together then inspired Jimmy Carter, who in January of 1980, desperately hoping to win a second term, but being viewed as a weak and ineffective president, inspire him in January of 1980 to promulgate the Carter Doctrine, which is a specific statement that now defines the Persian Gulf as a vital U.S. national security interest. And what that means is that's a place we are willing to fight for, just as we were then willing to fight for Western Europe or fight for Korea and Japan. So that statement then puts in motion what becomes a process of militarizing U.S. policy. Step by step, larger presence, greater willingness to intervene in conflicts large and small, brief and protracted, leading us up to where we are today, which I think, and many people, I think, define as, in essence, a state of permanent war. War has become a normal condition. Nobody expects that the war in which we are engaged, whatever you want to call it, if you don't want to call it a war for the greater Middle East, nobody expects that war is going to end anytime soon. Indeed, I would argue that nobody in Washington has a clue about how to end that war.
Jimmy Carter didn't just put on a blindfold and poke at the Persian Gulf with a pin out of sheer randomness. That had followed the oil shock of the early 1970s, yes. Right? And this was a purported response to that.
It was, and one of the tragic elements of this story is that Carter himself did not wish to embark upon this military course of action. Is a very famous speech worth reading, that he made in the summer of 1979. It's called his Malaise Speech. It's an utterly inappropriate name to stick to it. But Carter goes on national TV, and in the context of this real concern about the American way of life somehow being threatened because we no longer have guaranteed access to plentiful supplies of oil, he goes on national television. He says, "My fellow Americans, maybe the problem here is not that we don't have enough oil. Maybe the problem here is that we have bought into what is a false understanding of freedom. We've gone down the wrong path. We've become selfish. We've become materialistic. We have forfeited the values that, in his opinion, initially made America great." And so what Carter was saying is, let's take on this challenge of an energy shortage by changing the way we live. Let's opt for virtue rather than for selfishness and materialism. Of course, I mean, this had no appeal to the American people.
Doesn't even sound good to me now.
Well, you're right. Here, I got a good idea. I want you to sacrifice.
Yeah.
And Americans we don't look to our politicians to say, call on us to sacrifice, except in some certain circumstances like World War II. We want the politicians to say, there's going to be more tomorrow. And so Carter's attempt to avoid going down this path was derided. And I think basically the Carter Doctrine speech of January 1980 was a concession of defeat on his part. The only way he thought he might have a chance to beat Reagan in the upcoming election was to get tough. And so there's no doubt in my mind that Carter had zero understanding of exactly what was going to evolve over the following decades, but he let loose the dogs of war.
Just as a historical footnote, the U.S. did have one moment when it took some interest in the Persian Gulf area prior to then, because the CIA overthrew the democratically elected government of Iran in 1953. Right?
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Fair enough. I mean, when I overstated the point saying we didn't care.
Yeah.
We didn't care enough to have that be a place that we were going to invest military power in. Doesn't mean that we were not involved in various sundry shenanigans. And of course, the episode you cite also ends up being an element in the narrative as it unfolds, because the Iranian Revolution of 1979, from the point of view of the Iranian revolutionaries, was inspired in some respects by their not only their desire to get rid of the Shah, but their determination to get rid of the American presence in Iran and influence in Iran, which they perceived, whatever we think, what they perceived to be utterly nefarious. So yes, that's also part of the story.
Yeah, and another footnote, while the United States was supporting, and you point this out in your book, while the United States was supporting Saddam during the Iran-Iraq War, it somewhat incoherently was also selling arms to Iran.
Well, not only somewhat incoherently, utterly incoherently. I mean, the reason that's important to remember that, I think, is that is a prime illustration of the absence of any strategic clarity with regard to purpose. I think one of the reasons I might have a hard time selling this idea of a war for the greater Middle East, and that links a whole laundry list of military enterprises, one of the reasons I'll have a hard time is because people have become accustomed to simply seeing every one of these episodes as kind of a standalone proposition, whether it's peacekeepers in Lebanon or bombing Libya or humanitarian intervention in Somalia or going back time and again to Iraq, Afghanistan, where we have become conditioned to think of them as distinct episodes. The key argument I'm trying to make in the book is that only when we acknowledge that they are part of a larger enterprise can we then assess the extent of our failure. And when you cite things like the Iran-Contra affair, where Ronald Reagan is illegally providing weapons to the Iranians, who, while they're calling us the Great Satan, at the same time that we're supporting Saddam Hussein against Iran, that's a classic illustration of the absence of any clear thinking by the people in Washington.
In answer to the question, what the heck were we doing this for, which could be asked about so many of these military ventures that we've been involved in the greater Middle East, we go back to the Carter Doctrine, which was a reaction to the oil embargo. And your analysis is that most of this stuff was, at least in the instant, designed to preserve access to the oil of the Middle East via the free passage through the Persian Gulf.
Well, it was in an immediate and concrete sense. That is to say, at the outset, the war for the greater Middle East was a war for oil. But my argument is that even from the outset, if not clearly articulated, it was about much more. It was about affirming our self-image as the dominant power in the world, not simply dominant in a military sense, but dominant in an ideological sense. There is a deep-seated. This is the part of American exceptionalism. There's a deep-seated conviction, certainly widely held in our political establishment, but also widely held among ordinary Americans, that we define the future of humankind, that our values, our arrangements, our institutions, whether we can call it democracy using kind of a shorthand term, but it's much more than that. The American way of life determines the way the world is going. And events in 1979, citing the Iranian Revolution as a good example, but a multitude of events since, particularly in the Islamic world, challenge that notion. That we define the future. And I think psychologically, there's an enormous reluctance on the part of Americans, and again I would emphasize particularly Americans in the political establishment, to give up this claim to our specialness, our chosenness. There's a great reluctance to take on board the possibility that while we certainly are a great power, that maybe we are simply one nation among many in the long course of history. And so many of the efforts I think this is in spades true after 9/11, when George W. Bush is president and it immediately responds to the 9/11 attacks by saying on national television, look, we have faced this kind of adversary before. This is the equivalent of the hateful ideologies of the 20th century. This is Nazism. This is communism. And just as we destroyed those challenges, we will destroy this one. That is to say, we will demonstrate through the use of military power that we define the future. And I think at root, that really has been one of the driving considerations in this entire enterprise, to affirm, to validate American exceptionalism. And unfortunately, very few of the military outcomes that we have been able to achieve support that notion. I mean, at the present moment, where we look at Iraq, I mean, in my narrative, we're now in the fourth Gulf War. You know, the first one was 80 to 88. The second Gulf War was going after Saddam with Desert Storm. The third Gulf War was the war of 2003 to 2011. Lo and behold, here we are again, once again involved in another Gulf War that may or may not end in success operationally. But when you take those four Gulf Wars together, it sure the heck doesn't look like we're making a lot of progress in bringing harmony or democracy or even order to that place which really is the focal point or the nexus of the war for the Greater Middle East going back to 1980.